Hi, everyone, and welcome to lesson 2 of Remote Learning Week 9. Today, we are going to be learning about phylogenetic trees, which are also called evolutionary trees. So, maybe you've heard the term before, a family tree. Take a moment to pause and think, what does a family tree show? A family tree shows how people are related and generations over time. So, looking at this family tree, for example, if this was you here, you're related to your brother and sister through your mom and dad. And notice how you can trace it back to time several generations. So your mom has her own brother and sister, and then they're related through their parents, which would be your grandparents. So evolutionary trees work in a similar way. Today's learning target is I can read phylogenetic trees. Pause the video now so you can write this down. And a phylogenetic tree, also called an evolutionary tree, shows evolutionary relationships between species. Pause the video so you can write down this definition. Okay, so here's our first example of a phylogenetic tree. And when we read it along an axis of time. So time is increasing from left to right. So what's going on here? Okay, we see that there are different species over here and that there are some connections and some lines. Any species that is at the end of the timeline would be species that are alive today. So all of these species at the end, the raccoon, the bear, the dog, the sea lion, seal, weasel, cat, and monkey, these are all alive today. And any species that would have happened before them are no longer living. So when you look at these connections here, there's these little points called nodes. So that's when two lines come together and connect. These nodes all show, here's one more over here, these all show common ancestors. So what that means is the raccoon and the bear actually have a common ancestor or relative in the past, which would be this species that would occur right here. The species is not labeled, but we know that they're related at some point in time in the past. The dog and the bear and the raccoon share a common ancestor too, which is a little bit more in the past. You can see it's behind this first dot. And let's look down here. A sea lion and a seal also share a common ancestor, which was right here. And a weasel shares a common ancestor with this whole group of animals over here. So what this means is that over time, these extinct species, over time, there was a moment where they evolved or their traits changed to where they were different enough that they couldn't breed with each other, so they created different species. Remember when we talked about natural selection? So the traits in these species changed enough that they branched out and evolved into two different species. So the common ancestor here, just repeating myself, Over time, its traits started to change, and there were two new species that evolved from that common ancestor. Now, this also shows us what species are more closely related. So, any species that is directly connected by a common ancestor is more closely related. So, for example, the bear and the raccoon are more closely related than the raccoon to the dog because their common ancestor happened closer in time than the dog's common ancestor with the bear and the raccoon. Similarly, if we look down here, a sea lion and a seal are more closely related than they are to the dog, bear, and raccoon because that common ancestor was more in the past. Okay, we're going to look at another way that these evolutionary trees can be shown or depicted. So here's another way the trees can be shown, and it's showing the same information, it's just displayed a little bit differently. So here's our timeline. Present time is up here, and 10 million years ago in the past is down here. So which of these species are still alive today? Any species that is next to the present time is going to be alive today. So A, B, C, and D. Any of these species below the present timeline, these are all going to be extinct. Okay, now if we're looking, let's try species B and C. What would be a common ancestor of species B and C? We follow the lines, the common ancestor for B and C would be F. What if we were to look down here and look at J and H? What would be the common ancestor of J and H? That would be I. Okay? And what is the common ancestor for A, B, and C? A, B, and C are all connected by H. So species H over time split, turned into species A, split this way, turned into species F, which also then turned into species B and C. Okay, one more question. What is the common ancestor for all of these species on this evolutionary tree? The common ancestor for all these species would be K, because this species evolved and turned into everything else. Let's look at one more example. All right, here's another way that evolutionary trees can be depicted or shown. Again, same information, it's just drawn a little bit differently. So we have our timeline. Any species that's underneath the present line is going to be extinct. Anything above the present line is going to be alive today. And if we're looking at species F and I, what's their common ancestor? Their common ancestor would be C. One more question. What is more closely related? Species F and I or species F and H? The species that's more closely related would be F and I because they share a common ancestor right here, whereas with H, the common ancestor doesn't happen until all the way back in time down here. So F and I are more closely related, and you can also tell because they're physically closer to each other. Okay, so you have some check for understanding questions on your Google form that go with this diagram and that also go with this diagram. Okay, see you next week.